Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is Access for All, Public Policy to Shrink Michigan's Opportunity Gap. Joining Amy Liu on stage, please welcome the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Michigan, Brian Calley. President and Chief Executive Officer of the Hudson-Webber Foundation, Melanca Clark. President of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, Joseph Lehman. And to moderate the discussion, columnist for the Detroit Free Press, Rochelle Riley.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be joined by this distinguished panel to talk about probably one of the most important things that we can talk about here on the island or when we get back home, and that's inclusion. I can remember when inclusion, words like inclusion and diversity were not dirty words. They weren't attached with the taint of resentment or guilt or what did we do wrong. So what we'd like to do with this discussion is to look at the future instead of the past and look at solutions instead of what happened to create the problems. And I want to start with the idea that we need to focus on all those different ways, as Amy said, the opportunity gap exists. You know, we're talking about education, we're talking about job training, we're talking about people who are returning from stints in prison. So I want to start with the Lieutenant Governor and have a conversation about how we overcome some of those different gaps to move forward.
Well, thanks so much. I was really excited when I saw this as one of the pillars of the conference because this is so important at a time, I say especially at a time when we have overall macroeconomic trends going the right direction to make sure that people aren't getting left behind. And so there's inclusion, it's a big concept, and it's more than just being open to having people a part of the process that may normally get left out. It's the idea of being intentional about it. It's just deciding we're going to do it. And a few years ago, as I started some work in more inclusive hiring practices for people with disabilities, it became very quickly clear that inclusion needs to start a lot earlier in our education system so that kids with disabilities have access to the same education, have access to curriculum, have the best type of evidence-based practices around them to prepare them for the world so that they'll have more options by the time that they get to that place where they can find employment. But it's also more philosophically, it's about trying to get to a point where we think about people in terms of who they are and what their strengths are and not be so obsessed with defining people according to what we perceive as being weaknesses or areas of struggle. And unfortunately, with a group that I've been really passionate about with disabilities, that tends to be the case that they get defined more according to the can'ts instead of the cans. And really, everybody in this room, you've all got things that you do well and things that you struggle with. Well, what if you were defined by, and everybody knew you according to the things that you struggled with? I mean, you really wouldn't get a very fair opportunity to go out there and prove yourself in the world. And yet that is what people with disabilities face every single day of their lives.
Well, I'm glad you talked about definitions because sometimes we're not talking about people who are defined by anything. We've got kids who don't have any disabilities and are still facing an opportunity gap because of their circumstances. And Amy, you talked a lot about how to overcome some of those things too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important that there are barriers for children, but children's success is also very dependent on the incomes and health and well-being of their parents. And so I know that we need to focus on the younger generation and making sure they're in the right education setting and everything, but their home has to be a place of stability and security. And so I always like these programs that focus on the dual approach, where we're helping the parents find economic opportunity as we're also focusing on the children.
Melanca, nobody knows more about helping families and doing things in a community that touch every part of a family than the Hudson-Webber Foundation. We're talking in Detroit about some kids who everybody has a parent, but everybody doesn't really have a parent. You know, they have people in their homes, but those aren't people who are necessarily either reading to them, helping them, or doing anything except being in the way. What do we do about something like that?
Sure, the problems are complex. And first also, let me just say how pleased I was, like the Lieutenant Governor and all of us here, that this is a pillar of the convening. In terms of the approach, I think that holistic approaches are important just in the way that Amy has described. I also think, just to step back for a moment, I think it's important as we think about this equity and inclusion conversation that we get very explicit around certainly marrying sort of investments in growth in cities with investments in people, families, really skills training, education, all the things that connect people to opportunity and can bring them into the circle of growth and prosperity that we want to see shared. But the other piece is really being explicit about addressing racial inequity and barriers to opportunity. I do think we need to be explicit about that. I think that often, and I would challenge a little bit your comment in the beginning about, certainly we want to be future-oriented about that, but I do think, I know many of us were here for the mayor's presentation yesterday, and what was, it was great, but what was so remarkable about it was the whole beginning section that was a true primer on the way in which government policy specifically channeled investment away from African American neighborhoods and, of course, exacerbated, perpetuated racial segregation. That history is one that we don't talk about in our communities. We're not taught that in our schools. And I don't think that as we try to sort of get smart about the solutions, that we can get smart until we know that history.
Well, let me be clear. I was talking about this conversation, so we're not spending so much time talking about the past. I quite frankly think the mayor needs to do that presentation in every church, in every neighborhood in Detroit.
Fair point, fair point, absolutely. And I think there can be a certain defensiveness sometimes around hearing that history, but this is a history we may not be responsible for, but we are accountable to it. And so I think that's absolutely key. It is very much a both-and strategy. I think that, I've been with Hudson-Webber for the past year. Before that, I was with the Justice Department working on criminal justice reform policy issues, which, Amy, you also mentioned as a barrier. I mean, that's something that as we think about economic recovery, I literally think criminal justice reform is an economic justice issue. It's so tethered.
I think we can look to the future very well and not just the past. When people are ready to leave incarceration, for example, they're looking for the future. And often what they find is that policymakers have taken something that should be easy and they've made it more difficult than it needs to be. And I'm talking about just getting some of those entry-level jobs that would be the easiest to pick up just coming out of prison or jail, which, there are a lot of challenges there. The state licenses 160 different occupations. In 1950, 5% of workers in America needed a government license to work, and now almost 30% do. This correlates with no improvement at all in public health and safety. And so while a libertarian might say, well, just eliminate all the licenses, that's not what I'm talking about. Nobody's talking about doctors or lawyers or airline pilots, but there's no reason, I don't think, why a barber needs 30 times more hours of training than an EMT to get a license in Michigan. What's the reason for that? I mean, you might get a bad haircut from a barber, but if you cut your leg off, you're going to need that EMT. And this costs about 125,000 jobs in Michigan a year that probably aren't created. Costs families over $2,000 a year, the extra cost of all these licensing. And this can go over the heads of folks who attend conferences like these, because I think that a lot of us aren't as affected by these kinds of licenses and barriers as some of the people trying to get that first leg up on the economic ladder.
One of the things that the mayor and the governor have stressed a lot in the past couple of years has been this idea of college education versus career education, and trying to make sure that young people who are ready for careers or can be prepared for careers have a way to do that in Michigan, as opposed to the idea that everybody should go to college, everybody should get a degree, and then what? And I wanted to speak a little bit towards that particular gap, and whether that is something that I have some readers call me and say that's dumbing down our Michigan, populace, or whether that's smart.
Well, I think that we need to reject the notion that this is an either-or choice. There are a lot of academics that could be taught hands-on in trades type settings. And so I don't think you need to pick between them. I think that we just need to be flexible enough to teach the academics in different ways, hands-on ways. There are mathematics, for example, whether you're talking about algebra or geometry, there are ways that you can teach that in construction trade courses, to where the theories really come to life. So you're not memorizing theories, you're understanding what they mean and what they do and how they apply to the real world. I'd suspect, I hate to overgeneralize, but I suspect most kids would probably learn better with a hands-on type of an approach than sitting in a classroom just memorizing the theories behind it and hoping that they're able to connect that to the real world. So that's what I'd love to see us move to, a place where we're not just exposing kids to more opportunities and trades and all the things that are out there, but we're actually using those as tools. I mean, take FFA, for example. If you're in agriculture today and you don't know soil chemistry, you're not going to make it, because the productivity that you have to get out of the land is such that you've really got to know the soil chemistry. And I mean, why isn't science taught in that type of a setting as well as a potential option? So that's where we can do better, and we don't have to pick between academics and trades.
Yeah, I agree with Brian. It's not either or. Philosophers benefit from living in a world with good plumbers, and plumbers benefit from a world where a philosopher can explain why it's great to have plumbers in the world. So this isn't something that where we need to choose. But one reason we are apt to steer people through a sieve that looks like the educational institutions is because you don't need a license to go to school. You do need a license to be a plumber or a cosmetologist, and we have tended to conflate our highest aspirations for our children with one model, and that of the model of a college education. And I don't know, I did graduate from college, but I think I learned more from skilled tradesmen my first year on the job as an engineer than I learned getting a BS in engineering.
That reminds me of the heating and cooling guy who came over to let me give him $200, and then he just smacked the unit and it worked. And he reminded me, that you didn't pay me to smack the unit. You paid me because I knew where. So,
but I would just add, on the either or point, that we have to, it's sort of the fierce urgency of now, right? We've got to meet our people where they are. And so we can keep that aspiration, but we also need to support, I mean, when you think about Detroit, the unemployment rates, and we're talking about, college education, we're talking about basic literacy issues, the soft skills around keeping a job. If we want to have an inclusive recovery, we absolutely have to do the both and we don't want to put a ceiling on what our expectations are for any population, but certainly there are jobs that exist now that folks can't get. If they don't need a college education to get them, we need to provide the skills and the support they need.
Let's explore that a little more, because as you know, I've been covering the functional adult literacy problem in the state for 15 years now, and sometimes I feel like I'm banging my head against the wall because we haven't made the connection between business owners understanding that you've got to fix this and the people who have to fix it. There aren't enough literacy centers, there aren't enough people to teach the number of people who need to know how to read. But we continue to look at dashboards that say there are 70,000 jobs, there are 10,000 jobs, there are 6,000 jobs, which will always be there if we're not training people to take them. How do we get past the gap between businesses who need to provide that training and the people who are screaming for it?
Well, if I could take, I just want to take one subset or an example of, there's a lot of different reasons why somebody becomes an adult and they don't have literacy. And one of the groups that I've worked with over the past several years quite a bit with is people with intellectual disabilities. And just the reality of the situation is they may never have literacy. And yet, what we've seen with some logistical operational centers, for example, is that before, when they had a system where you had to read the label on a package to make sure that you got the right thing in the right box delivered to the right place at the right time, people that couldn't read couldn't do those jobs. But when this company decided that they were going to do better at hiring people with intellectual disabilities, they decided they would change to a shape and a color code on making decisions on what to do with the package and where it goes. And here's what they found. It was a more efficient system. It worked better for people who had literacy also. And so it was an accommodation that was made, but it simplified the process, and it made a lot of sense for the company. But sometimes it's it's this idea of meeting people where they're at. So sometimes it means that you need to intentionally change the way you do things in order to create opportunity for people right now, because some people can't really, even if you said, hey, we're going to help you go to school or we're going to help connect you to this sort of thing, but they need a job right now. And so that type of openness to doing things differently, sometimes, like in the example I gave, it ended up being a process improvement for everybody. More accuracy and more efficiency for everybody, whether they could read or not.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and that was good for that company to figure out a way to solve that problem. But what happens if that person gets laid off? Or what does that do for the overall percentage of people who need to have functional literacy? How do we do both? Make sure that somebody can work, but also make sure that you're increasing the aptitude and intellectual capability of folks who need it.
And you have to do it all. I mean, it's just a matter of, you have the short-term needs that you need to create opportunity, but out of that opportunity, I mean, for probably most people in this room, you get your shot at doing something, and that leads to more opportunities, more confidence to go out there and try new things. And so I just think creating opportunities intentionally, not just being open to them, but just saying we're going to make this opportunity happen, it just opens up so many more doors for people to do things that maybe they themselves didn't ever imagine they could do.
So Rochelle, I was just going to say that I do think that we still need more employer engagement in the skills and education arena. I know there are a lot of industry partnerships. I think more employers are getting involved, but it takes more than just coming to meetings, participating on task forces. It really requires really deep engagement, and not just solving problems for themselves, but for the entire industry, not for an individual firm solution. So let me just give you one example of where I saw this. GE Appliances in Louisville had the same problem. They decided, we're going to come back and reshore back to the US. We're going to come back to Louisville. In order to do that, in order to stay competitive in the US cost situation, we need to reshuffle the way we do our work, which means we do need different kind of labor. And at the same time, they saw that they lose from retirement and turnover probably 200 or 300 positions a year. And so they're struggling with both upgrading this workforce, but also filling constant gaps in the industry. I'm sure this is very familiar with a lot of manufacturers in the room. And they tried everything. They went to the community college, they went to do this, they talked to the workforce board, and never could they find a sustainable solution. And so they decided to take it upon themselves to issue an RFP. And they were agnostic. They basically said, we need a solution. We need someone to come up and tell us, how are you going to provide 500 workers per year, for instance, that fit this requirement? And if you can do that, we will hire and pay for the program. We'll hire the participants and we'll pay for the program. And they sent it out throughout the entire state, and they had no idea what they're going to get back. And they got an application from the local community college, the workforce board, the K-12 system, tapping into West Louisville, where a lot of the low-income kids and public housing residents are. And they came up with a solution about how they're going to prepare high school graduates for these manufacturing jobs by sitting through a very updated community college program, because the manufacturing credential program didn't exist or wasn't modern enough to meet the criteria that was in the RFP. When they did that, basically GE said, these workers, we don't care about their race, we don't care about their income, we just care about the skills, and the people who came through this program, the young people, were better than folks we hired off the street. And now they do almost all their hiring through this program. It's gotten such a good reputation that the suppliers started to use the same credentials, and the entire industry is now, and to the point where I've never seen a workforce board, a WIB say, wow, we've got so much demand from industry, right? And so this is where an employer took it upon themselves to send a signal about what they needed, and the partnership came that created something I think is more systemic, and that's going to create an ongoing pipeline for this really important industry for the long haul, again, tapping into a high school network. So I just think if we can see that kind of engagement for employers, I think that it could be that the community college or the high school will start to say, you know, to keep up with 500, we're going to have to focus on adult literacy, right? We're going to make other additional investments to make sure we can continue to meet this demand. So that's the kind of engagement we need to see from employers more and more across the country.
I talked to an entrepreneur yesterday on my drive here, and he has had many factories in Michigan and other states, and he told a story of where government cooperation worked well and a story where it absolutely didn't work well. Where it did not work well was he was referring to a program that I've talked about before, one of the corporate welfare programs in Michigan through the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, which selects some businesses for subsidies and assistance and tax credits and things. What he found was he was training his own employees and had worked with them through the years to get them the skills that they needed that they hadn't picked up in school. And the companies that were politically favored in some way that got the subsidies to create a new plant, instead of just nursing along an old plant for 50 years like the entrepreneur, his workers were going to work for the competitor. And I'm sure these jobs showed up on the balance sheet of the Economic Development Corporation's program, but they didn't subtract away the failure of, well, now we've got employers who are losing their trained workers to that. But on the other hand, he had a story of what worked, and this was in another state. He was training people to operate CNC machines. And he quickly found that he had become the training center for every business around, and his employees were leaving. So he partnered with the local community college, and this was an example of a partnership that did work, because the college wasn't providing any of this training. And he said, I've got this problem, what can you do? He said, I'll put up half the money myself if the state can put up the other half to provide this kind of training. And all of a sudden, he found himself, it was a good business decision for him, but he wasn't hemorrhaging all his employees. And of course, it worked for the employees themselves.
Well, you just raised a really good, well, both of those were great points. But Amy, you talked about how there needs to be a larger step up with businesses. Quite frankly, it would be great if that West Louisville program could be, done by a state or a whole city issuing an RFP to solve a problem. I would love to see that. But talking about not learning from our history, and I'm glad you brought that up, Melanca. I have been here for 17 years now in the state of Michigan, working in Detroit. And every year, we have the same problems with reading with the kids who are coming out of the Detroit city schools. And every year, we have those kids, we're talking about several missed opportunities. They get to the 3rd grade, they're not reading at level. They get to the 6th grade, they're not reading at level. They get old enough to drop out, and they drop out. And then you've got an unemployed person that you're trying to figure out how to fix. And yet, this has been true the whole time I've been here. So when do we stop that vicious cycle, and how can businesses step up to do that? Because you can't have the entire growth that we're talking about, and like you mentioned in your program, without dealing with the fact that you're continuing to push people into the unemployment pool from the time they're 6 years old.
Or earlier.
Or earlier.
Well, I'll take...
No, I know you all look stunned.
Yeah, no, I thought you were directing the question elsewhere.
No,
but
this is conversation.
This is an issue. It's just bigger than a school system on its own can handle, and that's when you look at just the overall aspect of everything that's happening in a person's life, the level of the level in the place where the education needs to occur and the environmental change that has to happen is just bigger. I mean, schools, there are things that schools can do to accommodate what happens outside of the school, or to mitigate what is not happening outside of the school, but that only goes so far. So the approach that if there's assistance, and this is where a lot of our social programs I think really need to move toward, is to the extent that we're providing assistance, that assistance should be tied to something that is sustainable in the long term. So not just sustaining a person where they're at that time, and that family where they're at the time, but how do you help them to raise their station in life? And in most cases, that's going to require something at the parental level. So if you have a child that's struggling that much, and I mean, it doesn't, I mean, I think for low-income areas, it's particularly challenging. But I'll admit that I really needed help and re-education about how to raise my daughter with a disability. I didn't really know how to do it. Everything that I did with my son didn't work for my daughter. Somebody had to spend time with me so that I could learn how to be the right parent for her. And so that's the when I talk about like an individualized education plan for everybody, which is what a model that I'd love to see, not just for some kids, but we look at that for everybody. But it goes beyond that. What is in the way of this child learning? And if what's in the way of that child learning is there is illiteracy in the home, then there are different ways that could either be mitigated or maybe permanently fixed. I mean, maybe it means that the parents learn, you help the parents learn to read. That'd be the best probably option. But maybe it also just means that we have reading coaches that spend extra time outside of school with these kids for a better short-term option. But the idea of just expecting that the finite period of time that a child is spending in school can solve the problem, I just think it's unrealistic.
Well, when you're talking about the type of, and I don't always like the word wraparound services because it implies something finite, but when you're talking about wraparound services for kids and a family, quite frankly, I think, what should the business role be in that? Is this something that, you know, businesses should do either for their own employees, for a particular neighborhood, for a particular portion of the city? If we're talking partnerships and talking about that overall growth and the bigger picture growth, what is the role of companies?
Well, I think flexibility is the precursor to getting the answer to that question. Businesses, if we're going to ask them to fill a need, they'll fill it if their survival depends on it. They'll have to. You know, just like my friend who said, "Hey, I'm going to fund this community college because otherwise I'm training and then losing my employees." And so there are many things that prevent companies from being flexible enough, and part of that is we've built a public education institution that's relatively impervious to big innovation. And Clayton Christensen would say we shouldn't expect innovation to occur inside large institutions that are kind of the incumbent institutions. It comes from outside.
That's really sad.
What's that?
That's really sad. To not expect innovation from inside large companies.
But you see, it doesn't happen. Even happens to companies. Digital Equipment Corporation is the classic example that Clayton Christensen leads with, and they got their lunch eaten because innovation is very difficult from within. And so you talk to the taxi cab industry. I'm sure they thought things were great until Uber came along. There was nothing that prevented the taxi cab industry from inventing Uber on their own, but they didn't, because they didn't have the same pressures. And so if government policy in general can create a climate where businesses are free to try, free to fail, with maximum flexibility, if they're not sort of steered into always having to partner in a cookie-cutter way with the local schools, but to try different things, and with what Mitch Daniels is doing at Purdue University, lots of critics. He's taking a risk, but I think Purdue has bought Kaplan. And so you have a kind of a flagship university in a state, and they've purchased an online college education company or online education company, and they're going to try to run them alongside each other because Daniels is scared to death that his own institution won't be able to innovate its way to the future from the inside.
So let me jump into your broader question, which is how do we break this cycle of poverty?
Yes.
Right? And I think we heard some of those ideas from the mayor yesterday, trying to right the wrong of history and making sure that we do create in neighborhoods and environments and stable housing environments that really allow people to begin to reverse course and find a different future. So I think a lot of different ways to break the cycle. I do think the one place where employers can help is some of the ideas that I talked about in my presentation, which is around how they provide work-based learning for young people. We put out a paper last year that I think the city of Detroit actually took a look at too, around how to make summer youth employment more meaningful. In the wake of the Baltimore riots and the riots around the country, I think a lot of mayors and cities have now realized that the summer youth program is one of the best tools a mayor has to capture whole groups of young people, touch them, really, that they may not be in the system, if you will. They may not be at a Boys and Girls Club. They may not be getting services. But this is the one time a year that they can touch a lot of young people. And so why touch them for 6 weeks, right, for the summer? So we thought, if there's so much energy around summer youth jobs, how do we make it better? One is, could we think about more employer partnerships? That the goal isn't, let's make sure 10,000 kids end up in a summer job. Maybe the goal is quality of the experience. That every employer who provides an opportunity for a young person has a job description, has a supervisor. And when that young person leaves that summer job experience, they're gonna walk out with a reference. A reference, a mentor, a contact that will then help them get to the next opportunity and get a taste of what it's like to have a positive professional work experience. But that means employers have to take that role very seriously, and we need more of them. But then the issue is, how do we extend that 6-week experience to connect kids to other city programs, or to connect to programs and opportunities that are year-round? And I think employers can really help provide those opportunities. Maybe they come in as seniors for a summer job. It can extend into a fall internship for some of those that want to do that. So I think that the most important way to break the cycle right now is the access to networks, the access to experience of soft skills, the desire to, and eagerness to see that they have value. People want to have dignity of work, dignity of contribution. And the more they get exposed to those career experiences, I think really can want them to, maybe we go on to college, maybe get a 2-year degree. Now I see why I want to get a certificate. And we just need to give that provide that incentives and reward for young people. And the only way that can happen is if employers provide that experience. So that's the experiment that we're starting to see in a lot of cities.
Including Detroit, actually. I mean, the thing that's remarkable is that, and not new to the city of Detroit, but the business community has come together around just this issue, and also particularly around summer employment. And I think the thing that's been really refreshing, and certainly is hearing Amy's examples of the wonderful things that are happening around the country. Business leaders, and I think this is very true in Detroit, really, like, some of this is not, there are such wonderful models that are happening outside of the state too. And so being open to that learning and bringing that in, and as I understand it, the commission, the Workforce Commission, if that's the right title, but that came together, actually commissioned work on how are these summer youth programs working well outside the country, and how can we bring that specifically into Detroit? That kind of collective action, so it's not just a one-off. I mean, there's not going to be true traction if it's just one business making a decision about what they're doing, but kind of linking hands, bringing these best practices in. And the public-private partnership piece, like, businesses can't move all of this on their own too. A lot of this work, we're talking about education. I don't want businesses necessarily in trying to develop the curriculums. No, I mean, there are certain areas of expertise and partnerships, and also just for the larger question of addressing these issues, we also want to make sure we have community voice. I mean, in lots of communities, and thank goodness, business leaders have come in to kind of try and develop the solutions for disinvestment and the like. But the other thing that has to happen is that the community has to have a voice in what's going to happen. And so we have to make sure that those efforts are married and that it's not just one thing or the other.
Well, I don't want us to leave without a little controversy. So let me ask an out-of-the-box question. I was intrigued by the mayor's plan that he does now to not provide tax incentives for developers who come in and create housing, and they don't give a certain percentage, of affordable housing opportunity to folks. Have we gotten to the point, because of the need in a comeback city like Detroit and in a state like Michigan that's working on reinventing itself and putting people into the river of opportunity, as the governor calls it, have we gotten to the point where businesses should be asked to commit in some way, sign a pledge of allegiance to this growth plan or doing something, and not necessarily having a list of all the companies or bad company, they're not doing anything, but maybe celebrating companies that are deciding to do what needs to be done to provide this type of training and to close the opportunity gap. I'm not suggesting outing big companies that do nothing, although that's what a column is for. But is it time to sort of take this very public? And, because you can tell the stories of companies that have done well and done things. We should tell all of those stories, but we should make people want to be the subject of those stories. Is that asking too much to make it a very public sort of report card?
But what has been happening in Detroit since there's been, with the great leadership that Mayor Duggan has provided and so many other organizations, institutions, is creating an environment where it just seems like there's more and more people that want to do those things. And I could give you many, many examples of companies that are going out of their way, both lending expertise to be a part of the policy-making system and making good things happen that maybe the city itself couldn't really afford that expertise, but the people with the know-how are spending time in helping to develop those plans, to directly creating the opportunities for people to go there and either build the resume, build the soft skills, get the experience, or at the end of the day get a job, and more than a job, a career. So those are things that are happening, and I'm a big fan of positive behavior reinforcement. So when you have something that's really good like that, it should be celebrated, it should be bragged about, it should be pointed to. And I think you will get more and more that are interested in doing that, but it's more than just because there's good recognition. I've noticed this sense of corporate social responsibility that is really permeating throughout all different kinds of businesses, all different sizes of businesses. And so I think the future looks bright because of that. So I think you're onto something. It's just a matter of really helping to keep the environment right so that it keeps on happening. If you got a city that's working well, people feel good about doing something to make it work a little better, as opposed to if it seems like I'm going the wrong direction, are my efforts really going to help? I think people feel like now I could do something and it's really going to matter.
The mayor's idea to restrict the tax incentives is itself evidence that the tax incentives shouldn't exist. It's a well-intended political requirement. Tax incentive programs are always going to be politically designed, and so therefore they're always going to trace back to somebody's politics, which is always going to make a big chunk of the electorate upset and lose faith in government in the end. His idea is about all the argument we need that they shouldn't exist at all.
I'll tell him you said so.
Can I just say one thing real quickly is I want to remind people too that I don't think growth in Detroit is necessarily assured. Right? And I think one of the things that we don't, not that I don't want to overburden companies, but small, mid-sized companies are still trying to just generate enough revenue to survive. And we need to make sure they have an environment to do that and stay in Detroit. And one of the things that when we were looking at some of the black employment numbers and wages, one of the things we learned is first of all, I just want to remind people, 2/3 of low-income people actually have jobs. And so they want to work and they are working, but somehow we're not giving them the pathways to get to better jobs. The other thing we're seeing is that in some markets, the reason why wages are dropping for African Americans is that when they change jobs, they go from a middle-paid job to an entry-level job, and they're slipping down. And that may be because the supply of good jobs are disappearing. And so how do we hold on to good jobs that are provided by small and mid-sized firms? And so I just think there's a lot of different factors that are really impacting what may be both on the demand and supply side of creating pathways for opportunity for people. So I think we need to focus on skills, we need to focus on employment opportunities, but we also got to make sure that those good jobs are around in the market.
That's the mandate, and we're going to leave it there. I want to thank our panel so much, and thank you all for staying to listen.
Stuart? Oh, that's horrifying.
I'm hiding from my bank customers. They want actual financial advice instead of just using the apps we made.
Money can be complicated, but at Huntington, we love answering questions.
Hey, I've been trying to get in touch with you to help me with my savings.
Ma'am, can't you tell I'm spending quality time with my son?